So we've now got a session where we have three of our educators that are forging the way forward for our students coming out into the future, and they're going to provide three views for the future for us to think about. I'm going to read out their bios so that we can then roll through their presentations with a nice flow. So Dr. Jacky Bowring needs no introduction really to this group. She's Professor of Landscape Architecture at Lincoln University and teaches history, theory and criticism and practices as a landscape architect, and as we all know has provided seminal publications in the field of landscape architecture across her career. Dr. Matthew Bradbury is an Associate Professor in the School of Architecture at Unitec Institute of Technology and a Program Leader of the Masters of Landscape Architecture. Matthew's recently published Water City, Practical Strategies to Address Climate Change, and the book presents ways in which designers can help make our cities better able to adapt to the environmental challenges of climate change. And finally, Peter Connolly. Peter is a landscape architect and an urban designer. He's an Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at Victoria University of Wellington and has taught at RMIT in Melbourne for many years. And he has also taught at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was the visiting professor at the invitation of James Corner. So I am first going to hand over to Jacky to kick us off, and then we'll introduce the rest as time allows.
Thanks, Renee. Ahi Mārie. Landscapes of care. So what are landscapes of care? Well, first, apologies to anyone who thinks that I'm going to talk about rest homes. While it's true that the concept of landscapes of care did emerge from health geography, including places like rest homes and care facilities, it's developed into a range of different threads, and I'm focusing on the way in which the landscape can be cared for through design. A sense of empathy for the landscape and the wider environment for the planet itself. There's a group of concepts that I've been exploring, some of which have never met each other in the literature, and I've been looking at how they work in similar ways. They are ideas like weak, fragile, frugal, austere, invisible, and they are terms which perhaps sound negative as approaches to design. So I'll just outline some of these terms to begin with weak architecture, to give a bit of a context for this way of thinking about landscapes of care. So Ignacy de Sola Morales drew on the frame of weak thought, or pensiero debole, when he coined weak architecture back in the 1980s. He was seeking to counter the totality and unity of modernity in search of a perspective which was responsive and yielding, a denial of the strong, the definitive and the universal. In architecture, planning and in landscape architecture, strong design is manifested in the imposition of ideas on a site, rather than the approach of care which comes through in a range of work related to these ideas, such as in the writing of Ioannis Polosma. Polosma suggests, because of the negative connotations of the word weak, we should perhaps use the notion fragile architecture. His perspective on fragile architecture is one which stands in opposition to so-called strong architecture, which, as he puts it, desires to impress through an outstanding singular image and consistent articulation of form. Instead, fragile design is contextual and responsive. Fragile design allows for the processes of weathering and ruining. As Palasma says, erosion wipes away the layers of utility, rational logic, and detail articulation, and pushes the structure into the realm of uselessness, nostalgia, and melancholy, which are also not negative terms. So these sources, Palasma and Sola Morales, are sources in architectural theory, and of course they're not new, but I've been tracing examples which resonate with this kind of thinking. Landscape architecture, which opposes the strong and muscular, and instead is poetic and yielding. One interesting connection is into Mark Tribe's work on austere gardens in the book of that name. He doesn't reference the thread of fragile or weak thought at all, but there are strong resonances in the position that comes with austerity. As he explains, austere is not about asceticism, but instead about restraint and simplicity. That is a term to characterise settings which, at their extreme, may first appear devoid of interest. One of the examples Tribe mentions is the Japanese moss garden of Saihoji. This garden is centuries old with layers of intervention, but the moss pond garden we see here, designed by Muso Soseki in the 14th century, was in fact originally made of white sand. It was only in the 18th century, when the monastery could no longer afford to maintain the white sand garden, that it became a moss garden, what Francois Berthier called the parasitical vegetation that invaded the grounds. As Tribe explains, admittedly to many, this plush carpet of green hardly qualifies as austere. But austerity does not always connote deprivation, however. It is used here to suggest a restriction in means. So the sense of landscapes of care are those which come from a position of attending and restraint, doing less rather than doing more. These landscapes are at the opposite of landscapes which are imposing and insistent in their narrative, placeless and generic, and perhaps overwrought in their symbolism. Another of Mark Tribe's books also resonates with the stance of fragile or weak design, but again doesn't reference it. This is his monograph on Georges Descommes, and the title of the book is Doing Almost Nothing. This title is a vivid statement of a self-effacing way of working. The title Doing Almost Nothing comes from a published critique of Descommes' Swiss Way, where the critic, after looking at the project, declared, "He's done almost nothing." And while this could be interpreted in a negative way, from Descommes' approach, this is exactly his ethos of practice, a contrast, as Tribe puts it, with bravado and monumentality. Descommes talks about how, as a designer, you're usually paid to add to a landscape, but he advocates the opposite. He points to the exemplar of Richard Long and his brushed path, and how sweeping and cleaning are processes of subtraction rather than addition. Tribe explains how Descommes used the idea of sweeping away to expose and illuminate what has been, as well as clarifying what is. Tribe describes how the designers intended to make present and sensible an ever-changing network of paths, routes, traces, and possibilities to make manifest the sheer complexity of the territory and to avoid the desperate reduction and negation of experience that plagues contemporary planning operations. And Descommes himself says he uses fragile thinking as an opposition to the formulaic and clumsy totality of the master planning approach. Instead, he favours discreet, tactical, operations, and he believes that even the largest of territories can be irreducibly restructured through small, laconic interventions as opposed to the unbearable excess of everything: objects, forms, materials. Marty Frank also does almost nothing in many ways, and he uses a word that echoes with Tribe's austerity. He talks about the frugal. On winning the Lanzine International Landscape Award for Infrastructure in 2020 for his project Girona's Shores in Catalonia, Frank explained, "The strategy is based on frugality, on recurring actions and successive observations and adjustments to management regimes." The sense of the frugal is there in the most subtle of gestures, in furniture repurposed from another project, and the use of some judicious pruning to create a view out beyond the site, in the best tradition of borrowed landscapes, one of the greatest tactics of frugality and fragility. Or in the placement of simple deck chairs to create the atmosphere for enjoying the newly discovered shores of Girona along the Tuia River. The approach is described as a kind of cocktail of interrelated ingredients that work in a reverse order to master planning. Frank talks about working with tactics rather than strategies, about the use of very simple means of working, with the site working with maintenance crews and the most basic of tools. Of slow design, they frame it for those working on site using if-then guidance. If the grass is like this, then do that. In their interview with Marty Frank for Landscape Australia this year, Alex Breeden and Liam Moritz used the term lo-fi to describe his work, a term which embodies the sense of bottom-up responses to place, where it is the careful moves rather than the willful gestures which shape the site. Kengo Kuma uses the terms humble, weak, and defeat to describe his ethos of design. Defeat is another of these terms which seems paradoxical. A seemingly negative term, but what Kengo Kuma means by it is that architecture is defeated by its setting. That rather than being imposing and assertive, it minimises itself. Defeat, he suggests, is that an architect must allow his building to be defeated by a particular site or situation. Humbleness also has a place in the toolkit of care. The Kobe earthquake of 1995 saw Kengo Kuma advocate for weak architecture, which was, of course, a challenging term in the wake of devastation. And people wondered what on earth he was talking about with weak architecture. But as Kate Goodwin explains, this is not architecture which is structurally weak, but an architecture which is anti-monumental. And as Kengo Kuma says of designing in the wake of the 2011 tsunami, as in this meeting centre for Rakusa Takata, the influence of the tsunami can show the humbleness in front of nature. The humbleness can be a reflection on the selection of material, of the detail and scale of the building, and the criteria for architecture after the tsunami is humbleness. An extreme of humbleness is to disappear completely. The firm 00:/, which is now fortunately pronounceably known as Architecture 00, demonstrate what it is to work invisibly. The brief for this project, now again it's another architectural example but a useful one, was to solve the problem at a school where the corridors were congested. The possibility was to develop an expanded circulation area to allow the kids to move around, estimated at around £3 million, as you see on the right there. Instead, Architecture 00 proposed to change the ways in which the bells were rung for the children to move between classrooms. It's essentially a free solution and a temporal rather than spatial response, one which is at the extreme of self-effacement in terms of design. As Jeremy Tiller and Tatiana Schneider observe, while many architects might simply classify this type of work as writing oneself out of a job, 00://'s approach is one where the invisibility of a physical intervention is considered to be a successful project. It's a great demonstration of, as they say, redefining the problem, perhaps using something like the 5 whys technique, which enables the question to be unpacked to its source. And it's a vivid demonstration of the ethos that designing is not just about, as Till and Schneider put it, adding more stuff to the world. So along with the big ideas of fragile, weak, austere, frugal and defeated design are numerous tactics. A toolbox of self-effacing, quiet, slow and careful ways of attending to the landscape. I've intentionally not referred to any Aotearoa examples of design today, and I would love to hear your ideas about Aotearoa's fragile design, and perhaps also its opposite, the muscular, strong design. So, homai o whakaaro, please let me know. Send me your ideas. Grab me later, email, call. I'd be very grateful. Ngā mihi ki a koutou.
Thank you, Jacky. And we now have Matthew Bradbury.
And like to acknowledge Ngāti Whātua, Araki, and also thank the Institute of Landscape Architects, TPO, for their kind invitation to talk. And I guess one of the critical themes of this conference has been the impact of climate change and how we might respond to it, how we might think about it. Emily Lane this morning gave a really amazing kind of picture of her research and her organisation's research, which is a fantastic resource for us to connect to, and I know Emily is very interested in connecting to us. Tomorrow we have got the inimitable Craig Pocock, and he'll be talking about how we can start to understand and mitigate the effects of climate change through carbon mitigation. Sorry, Craig. And we've also got the amazing Martin O'Dea from NZILA. And he's going to really show us the effort, 4 years unbelievable effort on behalf of NZILA to put together extraordinary documents to show their members how to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change in their professional lives. And if you haven't already, Martin just told me that's all online, so you should have a look at those kinds of documents. And I guess the conference is finishing with Conji Yu, and he'll be talking about his practice, and really he's, as we all know, helping the Chinese city build resilience to the impact of climate change. And in New Zealand, as you will know, there's a group of us who are working in the NZILA on ways we can help the members with these issues and responding to them. And we're working on a publication, and Rebecca's just produced 2 posters which are in the other room, so we really encourage you to post your comments on those posters, your thoughts about how TPO can address what is really going to be a central issue for us. My research interest, as Renee has said, is around the effects of climate change, especially pluvial flooding, on urban design, and it's really looking at the current urban models we have, and are they really going to help us with what's coming? The increased rainfall, the flooding, sea level rise. I guess my proposition is we're really going to have to change the way we build our cities. They're going to have to become more open, more green, more pervious surface. So recently I've been thinking about the idea of managed retreat, and I guess I'm just really going to give a few ideas, thoughts, sort of speculation about what that might mean. And so here we can see a chap in Beachlands who's obviously decided to take his own particular way to deal with sea level rise. Yeah, so when we think about sea level rise, I mean, I won't kind of labour this, but we all know the predictions. We all see models of various scenarios. We all know the impact of sea level rise. So even just in Auckland, if we just at random, just taking some kind of random images from geo maps, we can see living in Browns Bay isn't going to be so great. That beautiful house you have on Milford Beach, not so great, even though somebody is obviously giving it a go to protect their mansion. A factory in our industrial unit in Wairau Park, again not so great. As we've seen in Nelson, we've also got slips. So this is the map in Auckland of all the cliff areas in Auckland which are going to go. Churchill Rise doesn't look so great, and driving to work isn't going to be terribly easy if you live on the North Shore. We're all sorry for the North Shore bourgeoisie, but I guess also Tangata Whenua, Maori, this is big issue for them, and a lot of settlement urupara are located in these flood zones, and Kahu Bay with Ngāti Whātua's urupara is a really terrible good example. Okay, so again, I'm not telling you anything new. You all know about this problem. It's not just confined to Tamaki, but obviously Wellington, we've got sea level rise, especially you can see the Hutt Valley, so Rebecca's onto it, so that's good, and Christchurch has obviously got these kinds of issues as well. All right, so getting on to what managed retreat and what exactly what exactly is the thing going to be? Is it going to be packing up from the batch, or is it going to be is it going to be the fall of Saigon? I mean, is it we seem to have these kind of two kinds of ways of thinking about it. So I guess a definition of managed retreat is some kind of way, some kind of purposeful way or coordinated way of moving people and buildings away from risks, and this may include actually physically directing people, infrastructure, buildings, roads, or communities, especially away from sea level rise. And in New Zealand, again, even as Emily outlined this morning, we've got this National Adaptation Plan, which was just published in August, and that's about building a climate resilient Aotearoa. It's if you haven't read it already, really interesting, great document. It's really kind of a sort of summarising what the problems are and who's kind of working on these areas and who. And potential research, potential areas to work in, and so I urge you all to have a look at that. I think there's a really big place for us in that document. And again, RMA, the government's going to introduce 3 new bills next year, overhauling the RMA and replacing it with a natural and built environment bill and a strategic planning bill, and then this climate adaptation bill, which is really I guess the one we're kind of interested in, and it's aimed to help New Zealand better deal with climate change, especially managed retreat, and and sort of starts to kind of lay out exactly what that is. Okay, so what's it going to look like? And again, the mechanics of managed retreat. Chris Cameron, who's climate change lead at PDP, has written a really good article about what managed retreat might be. He says managed retreat involves relocation from high-risk origin locations to low-risk destination areas. So, we've got these kind of two problems. What's an origin area? What's the kind of rate of change going to be in that area? What sort of negotiations are we going to? We're going to have to kind of initiate in those zones. Managing, looking at the risk, looking at can those risks be removed? Can we use different activities in these kinds of areas? Maybe new kinds of public space. Perhaps we shouldn't be building new buildings in these areas, and so on. And I guess the other bit of it that seems very interesting is what's the destination? Where's this low risk destination kind of area? And so Cameron again talks about what sort of criteria we might have. Is it greenfield sites, a brownfield site? We obviously needs to be some kind of low risk. It's not susceptible to, sea level rise or flooding, and so forth. I guess, just to kind of summarise, one of the implications seems to be that, and as part of this kind of equation, there is a definitely part of it is people are going to have to move. People are going to have to kind of move out of where they live on these kind of edges, these sort of threatened areas, and so the question is, well, where to, and how are we actually going to get people to kind of move out of these areas? And I guess what is interesting is that actually people are already moving, and this is something that we've had pre-pandemic, but it's obviously been exacerbated by the pandemic. But people are actually moving out of our city. So we look at the infometrics of the survey in November 2020, which was right in the first year of the pandemic, and Auckland lost 13,000 residents to other areas. So if you look at the map, the blue areas are where people are leaving, and the orange areas are where people are going. Christchurch saw the second biggest internal migration, followed by Wellington, and so cities actually contributed to 92% of the declines that were recorded across the country. 7 out of 13 cities showed an internal migration outflow. There seems to be two types of migration. I guess there's one to the periphery. So, for Auckland, people are moving north and south. Southern Pakuranga, Papakura and Franklin area grew, and in a similar way, the Northern Rodney local board area also increased by 3%. Wellington saw migration to Kapiti, and in Christchurch, as I'm sure we all know, Selwyn had the most significant inflow of internal migration, up to 5%. So that's just in 2020. And then we've obviously got regional cities like Tauranga and Whangarei are also growing. These trends became more pronounced in 2022. Hawke's Bay's had the most significant growth from pre-pandemic levels, with 8.7% growth, followed closely by Gisborne at 8.5%. And at the same time, Auckland had the lowest increase with 0.7%. So this is a serious kind of issue. So why has this happened? Why are people kind of doing this? There's lots of reasons. Obviously, the pandemic had a big part of it. The growth of everyone having fast broadband, growth of Zoom, housing affordability. Auckland, it's crazy kind of prices, so people kind of selling up and moving. So So there are a number of reasons why people are actually kind of moving out of Auckland. Okay, so I guess I just want to dive down on one particular kind of area. It's an important area, which is we call in Auckland the Golden Triangle, and here's a great urban design journal, the Bailey's page, almost as good as the Saturday. The commercial property page on Saturday morning in the Herald. Always good to know where things are happening. And so this Golden Triangle, for people who don't know, is in the North Island, and it's this sort of triangle between Auckland, Hamilton, and Tauranga. This region makes up 50% of New Zealand's population, generates most of New Zealand's GDP, and the New Zealand government forecasts that it's going to have a 35% population growth over the next 25 years. So they're talking about something like 200,000, so between 2017 and 2033, something like 200,000 houses. I mean, it's insane, 12,000 houses a year. Okay, so there seems to be two types of urban growth in this triangle. One is the kind of on the periphery of the cities of Tauranga and Hamilton, and the other is kind of even stranger, is these sort of towns that have kind of sprung out seemingly in the middle of nowhere. So in Tauranga we have this extraordinary kind of new city being built at Tauriko. It's the kind of western gateway of the region. So this is the industrial centre. It's 200 hectares of industrial building here, and that's located next to Tauranga Crossing, which is probably the thing that initiated this whole kind of development. This new shopping mall started in 2016 and just kind of getting bigger. And next to all this is a new development. Tauriko West, this proposed kind of development for Tauranga to accommodate what is expected to be 30,000 new houses. Hamilton's the same, North Hamilton. Well, the north of Hamilton is a new port, the new inland port. So Ports of Auckland have an inland port at Horutu, and we also have the Te Rapa industrial gateway. But probably the big one, of course, is Ruakura, which is development by Waikato Tainui and designed by our colleagues here, Botham Iskall. It's New Zealand's largest integrated commercial hub. It's a 30-hectare inland port. It's a joint venture with Ports of Tauranga. Around that is a 263 industrial and logistics park. There's a 100-hectare knowledge zone which is connected to University of Waikato, and then as well as that they've also got a new residential kind of area, over 4,000 houses. So we're talking about maybe 400 hectares. I mean, it's essentially a new city that Tainui are building. So we've also got these rather strange kinds of occurrences. This is a manufacturer in Auckland, Sato. They do labels, and they've decided to build a new $4 million factory and housing for their staff in Karapehi, which is like a deserted dairy town in the middle of the Hauraki Plains, but essentially this kind of magic equation of cheap land and being equidistant between Auckland and Tauranga means this sort of thing goes ahead. So for again, for people who perhaps haven't heard about this one, this is probably the most extraordinary piece of new urbanism, which is the Sleepyhead factory. It's $1 billion manufacturing and affordable housing community, and essentially the head of Sleepyhead has decided to buy this land at Ohinawai in the North Waikato, and 176 hectares, and under this master plan he's building this community of houses. There's 1,000 houses, and then he's got this enormous factory, which is going to be up to 300,000 square meters. So, this is kind of back to the 19th century, where you have the paternalistic factory owner building these factories for his workers and his building. Crazy stuff. Okay, so is this bad? Well, it's unexamined. Let's say that. Perhaps we could say it's a sign of the times, and definitely the kind of idea of a polycentric urban region is something that is not unknown. It's a kind of a definitely known trope. It's something we consider something between 10 and 50 cities and towns. They're physically separate, but they're networked and they're clustered around maybe a couple of cities, but they draw their economic strength from this kind of network of kind of relationships. And I guess planners certainly suggest that metropolitan city regions are. Sorry, I'm going over time. Metropolitan city regions are this emergent urban form. It's kind of 21st century kind of thing, so that they are dispersed, but at the same time they kind of connect up. And there's obviously there's lots of examples in Europe. The Randstad, where you've got Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, Utrecht, the Rhine-Ruhr area. You've got 90 towns in that area, Rhine, Main. You've got Frankfurt, Wiesbaden, Main, Darmstadt, Hanau. So they're all kind of examples of ways in which this thing that we're seeing in the Waikato, the Golden Triangle, maybe can be understood, perhaps can be examined. So, in conclusion, I guess what we've got is we've got three things that are happening already. We've got climate change, we've got managed retreat, and we've got some kind of regional development. Managed retreat is obviously an official government initiative. There are many components to the strategy, but obviously one of them is moving people away from the effects of climate change and in particular sea level rise. And so where people are going to go, where are people going to go? I guess we do have this kind of phenomena. People are already going, they're already leaving to the provinces, and just by chatting to people at this conference, I've already met lots of students, ex-students, and they've already told me where they're leaving, or they're already living in the provinces. So I guess what I'm suggesting is the impetus is there, and I guess potentially the way in which this is happening is that it could be used to actually address these kinds of issues of climate change, not just sea level rise, but also flooding, increased temperatures. We need to live in a city that is greener and more open and with a smaller footprint. And so maybe this potential to kind of move to the suburbs, move to the regions is maybe it's a kind of a good thing. Although I don't know if you can see there, but that's the flooding in the Hauraki Plains, and Kiripati's in the middle of that. So maybe that's not such. Maybe you shouldn't have put the factory there. And I guess obviously one of the most prominent developers in the Golden Triangle is Waikato Tainui, the tribal authority of Waikato, and largest iwi group in Aotearoa in New Zealand. And so I guess Ruakura is a really interesting, model of what could be built in this kind of area. So I suppose we're starting off by looking at some maps, and we're looking at this kind of region, and we are perhaps could look at this map. So in Auckland, for us in Tamaki, I think we all start by looking at the Hochstetter map of the volcanoes, and perhaps also increasing the wetlands of the isthmus. It's kind of a talisman that we all kind of we would like to look at before we begin a project. Hochstetter also mapped the Waikato, or the South Auckland. This slightly intestinal map of the two Waikato basins could perhaps help us as landscape architects to help understand the potential of the Golden Triangle to keep ourselves and our whānau safe in this new age of climate change. Ngā mihi nui.
Thank you, Matthew. And we will now go to Peter Connolly.
Oh, you're just changing that at the back. Can't see the slides at the moment. Oh, no, it was something else. It wasn't me. Okay. Tēnā koutou, no te whenua moemoea oho, I korero ana te whenua mali, mi te awa baka ki toku naku, no mildura o, I noho ana o ki tapu taranga, ko pira oho, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I partly wanted to say that because when I was learning Te Reo, I was almost brought to tears when someone told me that one of the Maori names for Australia was Te Whenua Moemoea, the land of dreaming. It's such a beautiful phrase. I'm a landscape architect and an urban designer. I focus my teaching and research on the practices of the designing of landscape on technique. I'll probably have, in some ways this won't look like visionary stuff like a lot of people have been talking about, but to me the vision sort of comes through the actual things that happen through design. I'm particularly obsessed with how a designer engages with experience and sociality in the landscape. I spend lots of time developing fieldwork, drawing, analytical and design practices to experiment with socio-experience. For me, the main game of landscape architecture, how to make a difference to the world, happens through the design of landscape. Of late, I find myself reminding students that this only happens through the very concrete body-space relationships, whether that's human-environment relations or human-non-human relations. See if I can get this work. Let's approach this from a distance. Biologists have shown that organisms have spent 3.5 billion years evolving to live with the world that they have evolved with. They now understand that the basic unit of life is not an organism, but an organism-environment combinations, or assemblages. It is the combination that is powerful. It is only in certain parochial human culture, Western culture in the last few hundred years, that we have developed an understanding that we are somehow separate from our world. This belief has caused us all sorts of problems. This has not been a significant problem for most other cultures. How to go beyond this cultural idea that we are separate from each other and the world around us? Oddly, we also kind of know that we're not separate from the world. Yet we struggle to know how to embrace our connection, how to see our connection, how to work with it as a designer. This will require a little explanation for today. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has come to be very critical of the Western assumption that our way of relating to the world is that the mind leads the body. He says we tend to believe that there is something like a little person in our head that looks out at the world and more or less consciously and rationally evaluates what it sees and instructs the body to respond. He has found the exact opposite. For him, we do not consciously evaluate the world out there. We instead evaluate our own body's responses to what is out there. He also distinguishes the preconscious brain from the conscious mind. The preconscious brain works with the body and is already evaluating before consciousness starts to engage with our connection to the world. He thinks that we have not appreciated the many complex ways that our bodies monitor inputs from the world and our own body states, the bulk of these happening before consciousness. For him, we do not simply respond consciously or rationally to the world out there, we instead respond to how our own body has already, before consciousness, responded to inputs. Feelings or sensations are important here. For Damasio, the neural patterns that make up the basis of feelings have two mechanisms. There is the body loop mechanism, where due to sensory inputs from outside the body, what he calls the body landscape is changed. And then this is mapped by the central nervous system from the brainstem up. This results in a feeling that we may engage with consciously. This is happening all of the time. It is a real-time mechanism, if you like. The second mechanism he calls the as-if body loop. It is as if the body has really been changed by outside factors, but it has not. This mechanism functions without sensory inputs from outside the body in the preconscious mind. It functions, for instance, when a human animal, for instance, anticipates something up ahead, and in the process then unconsciously experiences the feelings associated with the predicted event about to happen. This allows the organism to respond in advance, to avoid, or to engage suitably. It is an inbuilt preconscious form of simulation. The same mechanism can also be done in isolation from a relevant event, as a simulation in the mind alone. In this case, the body inputs are not needed for the brain to feel what the body would feel. For instance, we could stand at the top of a riverbank and feel what it is like to scramble down to the water without actually doing it. And we feel the potential to us of a landscape as we enter the space. Again, these mechanisms happen before conscious thought. Damasio is here exploring part of what is called the sensory motor system. This is the bodily system of an organism that evaluates sensory inputs and responds to them through bodily responses and actions. Importantly, the response is not immediate. There is a small gap of time between the input and the response. The gap allows the body to evaluate the inputs and selects a suitable response. This also happens before consciousness. If the situation is something that has been dealt with easily before, the body responds habitually and the conscious mind may not even need to be engaged. If the situation is foreign, threatening, or captivating, or where it offers significant potential, the body responds more attentively, and these responses are experienced as sensations, which consciousness might register and respond to. Habit is important here. Habit is built up over the life of the organism. It deals efficiently with things that are easy to deal with, thus allowing the conscious mind to focus on what warrants greater attention. Habits also provide a reference matrix for evaluating inputs. Organisms are super-tuned to sense potential. The potential comes in the form of potential empowerment. An organism is directly empowered by its sensory connections to the world around it. And habit also provides a means to sense the potential and the relevance of any relationship in that connection. After this evaluation, the sensory motor system also then provides the response that will work with this potential. Here are some human environment assemblages, combinations, where you should be able to feel something of the different varieties of power that they can produce. Here is another one suggesting the distributed and spatial nature of this power. And here I'm talking about a type of power which is probably a bit different from maybe has been discussed today, where it's more like a power that's within the connections of things, within where we are now. We don't tend to notice it. The response produced by the sensory motor system is a power, an empowerment of the body that the 17th century philosopher Spinoza called affect, or simply joy. Recent thinkers call this power affect with an A. This is a power that is produced by its connections. Such affects are energizings of the body or energizing actions of the body. Joyful affects are uplifting sensations or actions. These are very concrete. These powers or effects are shared across the connections of the assemblage. Such involuntary produced responses and powers may come to consciousness and consciousness may start to respond or experiment with them. We are experts at surfing the joyful sensations and powers that the body has already started to produce. Effects can also be disempowering. Each species has evolved certain abilities to directly connect with and respond to the world. At any particular time, each individual organism will have a certain disposition or orientation towards the world, and each particular human culture will have their own empowering assemblages and ways of making sense of them. Before consciousness, each species, culture, and individual disposition focuses on certain sensory inputs, only certain direct connections, and are empowered by these, and ignore those that are less relevant to the particular situation it is in. partly saying this because there tends to be an idea that where we have this sort of interpretive thing and we're subjectively interpreting the world out there. And recent thinking has suggested that maybe things are much more directly connected to that, but we have a certain different relationship to it. So there is involuntary power associated with the direct bodily connection. However, we tend to be restricted to habitual forms of power by the way our culture simplifies things and tends to disconnect us from the power of direct connection. In this conception, consciousness might seem disempowered. However, consciousness is powerful not because it is the source of all things, but because of its ability to work with what has come before it. Consciousness is powerful to the degree that it engages and experiments with the power that the body is already starting to produce in combination. Together, this combination of conscious and pre-conscious body and brain and body is a powerful problem-oriented experimental machine. Another point to make here, which also goes against common sense, is that the unfolding connection we have with the world is expressed in the empowerment, in the affect. Before consciousness, the whole of our unfolding relation to our environment is expressed through our unfolding effects. So that a joyful experience expresses the world. A joyful experience expresses the world that produced the joyful experience. The world is expressed in the experience, which goes against common sense. And before consciousness, our bodies are continually making sense of our direct connection with the world. Each power comes with a pre-conscious significance or sense. Each power expresses its sense. This sense-making also makes the worlds that we unfold within. Worlds are also produced before we are conscious of them. Think of the tribal market or the picnic that I showed. Yet we sense the world, and we can also feel the relevance of any part of the world that plays a role in our empowerment. The world can be sensed being expressed in sensations, qualities, bodily movements, objects, surfaces, spatial relations, intense moments, whatever. However, because affects and their expressions, significances, and worlds are not visible and happen before consciousness, good old Western common sense strongly tends to not grasp or understand them. Another thing Western common sense doesn't deal with well is sociality or collectivity. Giacomo Rizzolatti identified the as-if body loop, that the as-if body loop is not restricted to a single animal or a human's experience. His studies identified what he terms mirror neurons in primates and humans. These are neurons that discharge both when the monkey or a human performs a specific action and also when it observes another individual performing a similar action. So the same neurons fire when we observe someone else doing something as when we are doing it ourselves. This contrasts with the traditional Western understanding of ourselves, which is assumed that understanding others is about attempting to understand their conscious minds, and that this is done more or less consciously and based on rational inferences and predictions. The discovery of mirror neurons calls this account of the theory of mind into question, suggesting instead that knowledge of other minds occurs at a more primitive level, and is not just about minds, it is instead about bodily responses. This mirroring process is not carried out consciously, but happens automatically and unconsciously, and according to Gillespie, it is likely a basic organizational feature of our brain. The purpose of this mirroring is social. It is to create an interpersonal link between humans or between other animals. We feel what others feel when we are watching their actions and responses. Well-known New Zealand dance choreographer Michael Parmenter describes how when we watch a dancer, we feel what they feel. Likewise, we find films engrossing as we cannot help but feel what the actors are experiencing. We are taken along for the emotional ride, unless it is a crap movie. This process is automatic and happens before consciousness. Such mirroring of responses and actions in observers produces understanding and emotion between individuals at the level of the body itself, rather than primarily at higher cognitive levels. According to Gillespie, our system resonates with the system of the other person who we are observing. Where am I? Our neuroscientists don't just talk about mirror neurons, but also about shared systems. This allows us to sidestep the old problem of how we know other people's minds, because this is the wrong question. It is instead about how we connect to their bodily responses and actions. Such shared actions occur in the body and between bodies, linking bodies and preconscious brains rather than the conscious mind considered independently of the body. Other writers have discussed discuss the contagious nature of effects and the transmissibility of affects, so that effects are not just individually felt, but freely shared between people due to our inbuilt abilities to sense responses and affect through watching, experiencing, and interacting with others. To extend this, the effects are not just freely shared between people, but also with our worlds. Preconscious affects join us to each other and to our worlds. Our worlds are collective worlds, and where collective is not just about human collectives, but about a collectivity that is human and non-human. And this all happens before we have thought, but us Westerners tend not to notice it. I hope you get some sense that this might be relevant to design practice. Let me describe one thing. I've said that the as-if body loop and shared circuits allow an organism to simulate their own or another's bodily empowerment, separate from the actual response happening in real time. So that a designer, for instance, can come to a particular site that they are working with a certain disposition, one oriented toward a certain spatial problem. They are then able to consciously employ this bodily simulation process to connect with and start to identify the particular relevant involuntary actions or experiences that they have experienced or observed being experienced. The sensation of the response produced by the simulation then facilitates their ability to sense the relevant spatial factors that interact to produce this experiencing. They are then able to start to produce drawings which show some of the key relevant spatial relations in a way where we can see or imagine the relation to relevant human bodily movements. So if we have done this well enough, what we have now is a designally simulation of reality, where on one hand we have the involuntary responses, the involuntary experience, and on the other some of the key spatial relationships of this reality that produce that experience. The drawing, being a drawing, can then allow us to manipulate these spatial relations and hence start to manipulate and experiment with the realm of experience that we have started to identify. On the left are a small selection of a very extensive documentation of how edge conditions around Wellington facilitated different responses and effectual actions in Jessie. She custom developed a practical set of drawings to visualize the relevant body-space relations. The combination of a connection to affect and the relevant spatial relations became part of the designer's body. This allowed Jessie to have a stronger ability to be able to sense and experiment directly with what drawing could do with the experiential power of edges. So that effectively drawing, you can work at life through the drawing. To conclude, such experimentation can, in relation to the relevant spatial problem, then be an experimentation with our connection to the world and to others, with our part in human and non-human, human and human non-human collectives, with the uniqueness and power of experience, with the production of territories and worlds, with the expression of the world in our design and experience, and all of these simultaneously, in the quest to make a difference in the world. Of course, this might make it all sound very easy. Hopefully this sketch at least suggests that there is a whole vast realm of practices to be developed, which I have, with many students, PhD candidates and research assistants, have been very focused on for some time. Ngā mihi nui.